Ladies and gentlemen, we want to continue now with our program, the final session before lunch. Strengthening regulation and supervision to foster stability is the title of this session. I mentioned in my opening the warnings from the IMF that came with the fund's endorsement of the sector. We've heard a little bit more about that throughout the morning. Warnings that speak to a lack of consistency in the application of standards, which the IMF says could stifle development of Islamic finance or encourage its growth in a manner that creates systemic vulnerabilities. This next panel will address the need to tailor regulations to the specifics of Islamic banks. It'll also no doubt provide more on what the IMF itself and the central banks and regulators in the region think is required in terms of a more centralized approach to regulating the industry. Let me hand it over again to our moderator, Dr. Jose Viñals, Financial Counselor and Director in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the International Monetary Fund, and he will then in turn introduce his panelists. Dr. Viñals.
Good morning. Good morning to you all. Sabah al-Khair. We are about to start our panel on regulation and supervision in Islamic finance and its enhancement as a means to foster financial stability. Let me just introduce the conversation that we're going to have in the panel, saying that regulation and supervision is to the financial system like the foundations of a house. A house cannot be solid and cannot withstand shocks if the foundations are not rock solid. And this is the purpose of regulation and supervision. Regulation is having good rules, but at the end of the day, good rules are only as good as the enforcement of the rules. And this is why you need not only regulation, but also supervision. Second point I want to make is that having stronger regulation and supervision for Islamic banking and for the overall financial system is particularly important at a time like now, when uncertainties are increasing, particularly at the global level, and where countries also have their own domestic challenges. To discuss these issues and how can we enhance regulation and supervision in Islamic finance, and particularly in Islamic banking, we are privileged today to have a very distinguished set of panelists. And I'm going to introduce them now in the order in which they're going to intervene. Our first panelist is Governor Sethi, who is the governor of the Central Bank of Malaysia, of Bank Negara Malaysia. And I want to mention one thing about Governor Sethi, which is that she's one of the longest serving central bank governors in the world. She's also an example of financial inclusion in terms of gender. And in addition of being a champion of Islamic finance, she's a member of the governing board of the International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation. So, Governor Sethi, please come to the panel. Second panelist is His Excellency Governor Abdelatif Jouheri, also long-serving governor of the Central Bank of Morocco, of Bank al-Maghrib, and previously Minister of Finance of that country. Please, Governor al-Jouheri. We also are privileged to have with us Mr. Jassim Ahmed, Secretary General of the Islamic Financial Services Board, which, as you know, plays the role of being the specific regional body in charge of adapting the global regulations to the world of Islamic finance, and who previous to that was a director at the Asian Development Bank. So, Yassine, welcome. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce Mr. Khalid Hamad Abdul Rahman Hamad, who's Executive Director of Banking Supervision at the Central Bank of Bahrain, and also Chairman of the International Islamic Financial Market. So, Mr. Hamad, please come to the floor. Thank you. Thank you. Now that we have completed the panel, we can start the conversation. And as Masoud Ahmed was saying before, I hope that towards the end of this panel, we will have time for a few questions from the audience so that we can make this a two-way conversation rather than a one-way conversation between all of you and us. So let me start this discussion by asking Governor Sethi, who has, as I said, championed Islamic finance and taken on board and helped develop a number of national and regional initiatives to promote Islamic finance. What, in your view, are the major challenges for the adaptation of the regulatory framework for Islamic banking, which are most important to highlight?
Yes. Perhaps, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you to the IMF and the Central Bank of Kuwait for the invitation to participate in this panel, and congratulations to its, the magnificent outcome that is taking place. Well, I would like to mention 2 points before proceeding to respond to that question. The first is that Islamic finance already has embedded in it financial stability elements arising from 2 elements. The first being its linkage, a strong linkage to the real sector, and secondly, being profit sharing and sharing of risk, the checks and balances. But we recognize that given the uncertainties, the rapid changing international financial landscape, we do need to strengthen regulation and supervision. But I would like to add one more point that is generally overlooked. Not only do we need to strengthen the regulatory framework and the supervisory regime, but also the development of the financial infrastructure. That is so critical in maintaining financial stability in any financial system, especially for emerging economies, but not only that, but also in the developed world. So in response to the issue that you have raised, that we face challenges in the adoption of standards to safeguard financial stability. And one of the constraints is that most of us are at different stages of development and different size of Islamic financial system. So if you're just evolving an Islamic financial system, obviously you don't have the scale to have a whole huge department that will undertake the supervisory oversight and so on, that really you need to take that into account. And then the second aspect that generally presents challenges is the inconsistent, we don't have consistent interpretation of these standards. And thirdly, many of the standards are, the adoption of these standards is voluntary. We all know that in the conventional financial system, G20 countries have agreed to adopt the financial prudential standards. But however, in Islamic finance, we are still at that stage where the standards that have been issued, and especially by the IFSB, they have issued already 22 standards, and also the accounting standards that have been issued by IOFI. These are voluntary in terms of adoption and implementation. Then, of course, you have Sharia compliance that is very, very important to be adopted. And you need really a robust framework for Sharia compliance. And you also need the governance framework of how this is to be adopted. And finally, you need enforcement. And this is a framework for enforcement. But just very quickly, with all these challenges, a lot of efforts have been made to address them. And firstly, some countries, some central banks have prepared roadmaps of how this can be. They've prepared roadmaps. Secondly, they allocated resources, and then data collection, talent development, and capacity building. But it's not just us who are going to be the ones who are leading the efforts for these adoption of these standards. IFSB, and they can address the different size of Islamic finance and different significance by having scalable standards. And then the IMF can also do its part by, in the AFSAP, if you have your financial sector assessment program, if you include assessing the adoption of standards, then of course you instill that discipline and contribute towards financial stability in Islamic finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Seti. For those of you that may not be familiar with the FSAPs that Governor Seti mentioned, this is like a medical checkup for your financial system. This is something that you don't do every day. You don't even do it every year. You do it from time to time, but which is extremely useful in order to tell you that you're healthy, to tell you where are your weaknesses, and to give you some recommendations on how to move forward. So like going to the doctor, it's something like that takes time. It takes some effort, but I think that it ultimately pays off. And I think that your recommendation is very, very welcome. Dr. Seti, you mentioned the issue of Sharia compliance, and I would like to ask Jazim Ahmed, to what extent do you think that lack of Sharia compliance is an obstacle to the development of Islamic banking?
Thank you very much, Jose, and I would also like to echo Her Excellency Governor Seti by thanking Governor Herschel, His Excellency Governor Herschel, and Madame Lagarde for the opportunity to be here, and for Madame Lagarde in particular for mentioning the IFSB and the IMF's role in the in the establishment of the IMF. And I should add that when I spoke to the IMF last year, to your interdepartmental working group, I was welcomed by a senior staff member who said to me that, we don't know too much about Islamic finance. And my response was, I don't know what you know or don't know, but what I know of Islamic finance, I learned from the IMF, from some of its most legendary writers. So thank you very much. I think Sharia compliance is, of course, fundamental. I mean, Sharia compliance is the question of authenticity and legitimacy. Without it, you can't have Islamic finance. The challenge in terms of Sharia compliance occurs at a number of levels, and Governor Zethi has already mentioned the differences across schools, which can be a problem, but perhaps it's a problem that is now diminishing as more and more opinions are being recorded, and a greater sense of and a greater convergence is taking place. At the same time, there are some critical issues where there are significant differences, and they remain a problem. I would like to just highlight one specific area where I think it's very important for Sharia scholars, policymakers, and regulators to continue a dialogue that was initiated some time back. And this is really on the question of issuance by the sovereign of sukuk and other Sharia compliant securities, whether on a general business of government concept, or whether on individual project concepts, because this is actually reaching a firm set of conclusions and opinions by the Sharia across countries in a convergent way is, in my view, perhaps most important here, because as we can see, the presence of a sovereign sukuk program, a presence of the ability to issue benchmark yield curves by the government across countries is, in a sense, a harbinger or an indicator of governmental commitment over the long run, as well as a government understanding of the fundamental needs of an Islamic banking sector for liquid Sharia-compliant securities. And to achieve that, one does need to have these kinds of sukuk readily available. To reach that goal, each nation, and I hope nations together, will be able to have an informed debate that allows Sharia scholars to point the way towards more well-structured, more liquid Sharia-compliant instruments. I think there are many issues, but that would be the one area that I think is absolutely of vital interest for us to make progress on.
Okay. Yeah, you emphasize the issue of cross-country consistency, which I think is very important in all dimensions, particularly on the regulatory and supervisory dimension. Let me turn now to Mr. Hamad. You, as responsible for the supervision of banking in Bahrain, which is one of the countries with a significant portion of Islamic banking, what are, in your view, the main challenges that need to be overcome in order to enhance the regulatory and supervisory standards for Islamic banking?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to express His Excellency Rashid Al-Ma'raj apology for not being able to be with us today, because he was called in for an unexpected government event today. Although he was keen to participate in this session. Before I comment on to this question, can I comment on the earlier two questions? I have some thoughts to add to what Her Excellency and Brother Jassim mentioned. You asked about the challenges to the adaptation of the regulatory requirement to Islamic finance. I think, one of the most important challenge is the political will. If there is no political will in the jurisdiction, Islamic finance will not rise in that country. And we've seen this in some countries. Another area which is also important is the acceptability of Sharia scholars in that jurisdiction and the public at large. And we've seen some scholars who are against Islamic finance, and that's the fact. Not scholars who are serving in Sharia board of banks, but scholars who are serving probably in universities or in any religious functions. And of course, the public at large is important that the public is also interested in Islamic financial services. And we've seen customers who are not interested in Islamic finance in different jurisdictions. Although we've seen growth, substantial growth in different jurisdictions in Islamic finance, but still, even within the Muslim community, we've still seen some customers who are not interested in Islamic finance. Why? That's another challenge, which is the absence of a well-developed communication plan or strategy to tell the whole world or the public at large and everybody who's interested, from government to business to customers, what exactly Islamic finance is all about. Is it a religious business model, or it is a business proposition which has all what it takes to serve in a better way than conventional finance? And the financial crisis, the lessons learned from the recent financial crisis is a good example of what ethical finance is all about. And that's the story of Islamic finance. So there is a need for a well-developed communication strategy that needs to be developed by both the regulators and the Islamic banks. Today, if you go, for example, in the market, for an average person, and you ask that person, what is investment account is? Is it a deposit or what it is? They will tell you it is a deposit. The majority of the customers of the Islamic banks. Why? Because of our failure in addressing this communication gap. And there are so many products in Islamic finance, the public at large don't understand it. If they understand it, they will feel that this is a sustainable model which has a lot of elements of self-defense. Yeah. Another challenge that I've also seen is the availability of skilled resources. If you don't have the skilled resources in that jurisdiction, it's no way that you will be able to develop Islamic finance. Islamic finance contracts are complicated. It needs a lot of knowledge in Sharia, a lot of knowledge in accounting. There's a different set of accounting than for conventional finance. So without that, Islamic finance cannot move in that jurisdiction. And coupled with that, there is a need for a well-developed training facilities to be able to develop and groom leaders and practitioners in Islamic finance. Last but not least, in terms of the challenges, there should be, or there must be, a recognition that Islamic finance is different. And we should not be selling Islamic finance as a religious model. It is an alternative business model to conventional finance, which has different characteristics and features that needs to be required. Now let me go back to the question.
Let me just
Sure.
make a comment on what you said on the issue of communication, and this is just a personal anecdote. Yesterday I was talking to two Kuwaiti residents, and one was saying, well, I work with Islamic bank, and the other was saying, well, I work with a conventional bank. And I said, could you explain me why? And the person who worked with the Islamic bank said, because I think I have a more certainty that my money would be used for purposes with which, I would agree, that make me feel better. And the other person said, yeah, that's right, but you see, the problem with Islamic finance or Islamic banking is that I don't understand it, and I don't think I ever will. So I think that the issue of communication, of pedagogy in understanding, for people to understand, for the normal consumer of financial services to understand Islamic finance is an important one. Just
but can I respond to the issue of the Sharia compliance as well?
Yes,
which
please.
Brother Jassim also mentioned. The simple answer is yes, theoretically speaking. But in practice, we see totally different world. When we see, for example, the reaction of board of directors and regulators to a bank not fully compliant with Sharia. As you know, if a bank doesn't comply with Sharia in a transaction and as a result then the income generated is non-Sharia compliant, then it's obligatory on the financial institution or the bank to disclose this to their shareholders in the annual report. And that is happening everywhere. What is the reaction so far of board of directors and Sharia scholars and their customers of this bank to such disclosure? The answer is nothing. So far. From practice, we don't see any reaction by the stakeholders to this issue. So the answer is yes, theoretically, but in practice, we've seen differences. Another issue, for example, that we've seen in practice is several of these investment banks and companies who operate under Sharia. They invest abroad. And then when they go and invest abroad, they face this challenge of finding the right financial institutions to fund or to finance the transaction, i.e. leveraging. So there is no way to do this transaction other than to basically go to a conventional finance solution. And when they do this arrangement, they basically insulate themselves through a third party to arrange for that finance. So again, theoretically, yes, Sharia compliance is a precondition, but there is, in practice, there is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamad. Let me turn now to Governor Chouari, and then ask you the question, with your long experience as a central banker, what would be your ideas regarding the key steps that can be taken to improve the conditions for effective banking supervision for Islamic banking?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أنا سأتكلم باللغة العربية. أود أن أذكر بالنسبة للتجربة المغربية أننا لسنا إلا في البداية، لأن القانون البنكي أو المصرفي الجديد أصدر في بداية هذه السنة، وضم فصل بالنسبة للتمويل الإسلامي والبنوك الإسلامية، أو احنا سميناها التشاركية. وبالنسبة للترخيص سنبدأ في الترخيص في غضون السنة المقبلة. إذن احنا كيف تنقولوا في بداية المشوار، لكن لتكون في بداية المشوار ولا شك على أنه يمسح واحد المسح كبير بالنسبة للتجارب وبالنسبة للعوائق اللي أمامه، حتى يتجنب الأكثر من هذه العوائق. احنا بطبيعة الحال مشينا في هذا الاتجاه، لا سيما بالنسبة للإشراف البنكي بالنسبة لهذا الصنف البنوك الإسلامية. العوائق أولاً، وأنا بطبيعة الحال اللي سبقوني في التدخل، أولاً بالنسبة للعقيدة، ما هنا توحيد في الرؤية. احنا حاولنا في هذا الميدان أن داخل المغرب نوكل إلى طرف واحد المسؤولية في التطابق ديال نشاط البنوك الإسلامية مع الشريعة. احنا دستورياً وقانونياً عندنا مجلس أعلى للعلماء، وهو الوحيد المخول له بالفتوى وكون لجنة تقنية منبثقة عن المجلس الأعلى فيها علماء وفيها إخصائيين، وهذه اللجنة هي اللي غادي تعطي الفتوى فيما يخص تطابق الشرعي مع النشاط ديال البنوك الإسلامية. إذن عندنا هذه النقطة تنظن على أنه غادي تسهل علينا بالنسبة للعمل المصرفي، ثم على أنه باش نتموا هذه النقطة هذه لزمنا داخل البنوك الإسلامية على أنه تكون هناك لجنة ديال التقيد داخلية اللي تتبع على أنه هناك تطابق بين الأعمال والأحكام التي صدرت عن اللجنة أو عن المجلس الأعلى ديال العلماء، ونحث هذه اللجنة على وضع تقرير سنوي يرفع إلى مجلس العلماء. إذن من الناحية الشرعية حاولنا ما أمكن نسهلوا أو نتجنبوا العوائق من هذه الناحية هذه. من ناحية الإشراف تنظن على أنه المجلس ديال الخدمات التمويل الإسلامية قام بمجهود وعنده مراجع، ولكن كيف قالت الدكتورة زيتي على أنه هذا مش إلزامي، تيبقى تطوعي بالنسبة لكل البنوك. هذا هو المشكل. تنظن على أنه إلا بغينا نسهلوا المامورية بالنسبة للإشراف لا بد يكون عندنا واحد المرجع موحد ونتفقوا عليه. بطبيعة الحال هذا المجلس يمكن يعمل مع صندوق النقد الدولي، يمكن مع أطراف أخرى، ولكن لزوما باش نتحداو هذه المصاعب في هذا الميدان ديال الإشراف على أنه يكون توحيد الرؤية فيما يخص المعايير والنظم اللي هي غادي تكون تنتمشوا بها بالنسبة للإشراف المصرفي. نقطة ثالثة أظن على أنه أساسية وقالوها الإخوان اللي سبقوا، هو تهيئ الكوادر اللي يمكن تكون مؤهلة كل تأهيل باش تقوم بهذه العملية ديال الإشراف. احنا حاولنا ما أمكن، وهنا ما تقوم به البنك الإسلامي التنمية هو مجهود جبار، احنا ربطنا الصلة به منذ مدة لتهيئ هذه الأطر باش يكون الإشراف على أسس متينة. يبقى على أنه المشكل ديال الإشراف ما تبقاش فقط ما بين البنك المركزي أو الهيئة الرقابية وبين البنوك الإسلامية، كذلك هناك الزبناء أو الناس اللي تتعامل معهم البنك. وهنا التواصل اللي قالوا الأخ هذا مهم أساسي ومن العوائق. حتى أنا إذا يمكن تكون عندنا واحد المنهجية موحدة فيما يخص التواصل غادي يسهل المامورية ديال الرقابة اللي يمكن نقولوا بها كبنك مركزي. شكرا.
Thank you very much, Governor Choueiri. Let me turn now to Mr. Ahmed and ask you for your views on how international institutions, regional institutions, and national authorities can better work together in ensuring the appropriate application of the core principles for Islamic financial regulation that your institution, the Islamic Financial Services Board, has developed.
Yeah. No, thanks very much. That's a very important agenda ahead of us. And it takes forward our original mandate, which was really to provide a consistent set of standards which would provide for both the internal national consistency and cross-border consistency in the regulatory and supervisory framework, as well as in the implementation. So I think it's the ex-ante as well as the ex-post. So in terms of the core principles, what we have done is reflecting back, and in fact this responds directly to what His Excellency Governor Herschel said in the morning, that it is undesirable to have a undefined set of issues where each country exercises its discretion, and that itself promotes a unhealthy set of practices which cannot be brought into into a consistent framework. So we responded to that by preparing a set of core principles for Islamic finance banking regulation, which now provide guidelines that are closely modeled on but adapted from the Basel core principles. So we have looked very hard at the Basel core principles, and where they seemed adequate, we've left them. So for example, in that first section in the BCPs on supervisory powers and processes and functions, there are 13 core principles, and the first 6 or so we have not touched because they are essentially the same for Islamic finance. But it's really in the second section, which is Basel core principles 14 to 29 on supervisory approaches, that we felt the need to introduce a common set of guiding principles for all Islamic financial jurisdictions in terms of risk management across various sectors. And what we now hope will happen is that the core principles for Islamic finance will allow a jurisdiction to identify the gaps in their regulatory framework from the perspective of a comprehensive and consistent set of issues identified in the core principle. And then they will be, in filling those gaps, what we hope to see is convergence towards a harmonized approach, at least in the basic supervisory framework. In taking this forward, I think the issues involve, first of all, the national jurisdiction carrying out its own assessment, if you like, its self-assessment, and we have one jurisdiction, that a very important jurisdiction, which has agreed to launch its internal program early next year. We expect that the IFSB we will be involved informally, but I think the real where the real benefits come is subsequently. Subsequently, there will be a need for international agencies to participate in at least 2 levels. One is in assisting in moving to peer assessments, perhaps, and the peer assessments themselves are very important to give to promote consistency in international practices. But then subsequently, I think what we would like to see is the use of the core principles to integrate Islamic finance not only into the global economy but into the global surveillance framework, which is led, of course, by the IMF and the World Bank in the FSAP process. So the FSAP process itself, if it is able to incorporate these core principles, would be a major step forward in providing a global overview and in global convergence, at least in terms of understanding, as well as in practices in relation to Islamic finance. Now, in the meantime, what we have also done at the IFSB is we have just launched our prudential and structural Islamic financial indicators, the PSIFIs, which are closely modeled on the IMF's financial soundness indicators, and they're up on our website, 16 countries. So you are now seeing data which allows for an assessment of the consistency with which IFSB jurisdictions are meeting the new risk-based capital requirements, capital adequacy, liquidity ratios, asset quality ratios. So I think all of those issues are things which will be very important for international agencies and regional agencies to take on board as part of their mandate, as part of their, into their mandate, whether it's for surveillance, whether it's for capacity building. We are not a surveillance agency, we are a capacity building agency, but I think these are issues that require a close cooperation between a wider set of institutions and the IFSB, in particular, IMF, World Bank, Islamic Development Bank, and of course the Asian Development Bank. Thank you.
Thank you. No, this is very important that you give us your point of view from the perspective of a regional institution, and also the emphasis that you put in the last part of your comments in the issue of the development of things which are like the financial soundness indicator. This is something which is very important for transparency. It is very important for everybody to understand the true health of these banking systems, and doing this on a comparable basis, I think that helps very much. So let me turn now to the national perspective and ask now Governor Sethi, from your point of view, what do you think are the main challenges associated with the application, with the adoption of Basel II, Basel III, or even with the adoption